so much. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. And thank you so much for, sorry, I'm just trying to, what do you call it? Multitask here. And thank you so much for the invitation. I really feel honored to be here. And thank you for being here to sort of think through this stuff with me. I really appreciate your attention, and in advance, I thank you for your feedback. And I'd like to also say that I'm thankful to be a guest of the Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so I'm very grateful for that as well. So today I want to sort of start, and I'm really glad that you made the connection, Kristen, to pedagogy, because I have some slides that are from my course slides, and I was feeling a little bit, I don't know if shamed is the right word, but I was like, oh no, maybe this is like sort of silly, but I hope that connection will be made clear as I go. But first I want to start talking about the questions that I tend to ask in my research. And Carly also already, discussed that a little bit, but, the types of questions that we ask in my research group are often questions like, how does language experience influence language processing? How language or variety or construction or speaker or instant, how specific in general are mechanisms of language processing, such as things like prediction or integration? What types of information are available for speakers to draw upon when they're doing these things? So that's a very sort of psycholinguistic contact typology way of thinking about things. And what we've come to as we're trying to answer these questions is that we really have to zoom out and think and take a look at some of our first principles or some of our underlying assumptions. And so here are two that are really relevant for the issues I'll talk about coming up. So one is, how should we characterize language experience? This question, and also how should we deal with variation? And you can think about that in lots of different ways. So both these questions construed broadly. So like I said, I'm going to start with sort of how I introduce a particular way, or the sort of linguistic way of looking at language to students. So that's why I wanted to show you. So bear with me if this is kind of like basic, but I think it helps get a sense of what I mean by, sort of going to these first principles, thinking about what our underlying assumptions are that we need to sort of maybe question as we build our theories, which is so, what I start with when I talk about this in classes, for example, is sort of, as linguists, we think about language as being something like an emergent phenomenon. So you might have people like these, three different people. And maybe when, person one and person two talk to each other, they use different linguistic features that they have in common. Like I use these ones because it's very relevant for me, but also in Michigan where I'm at, like things like bag and soda. And maybe when person one and person three talk to each other, maybe they say things like bag and pop. And maybe when person two and person three talk to each other, maybe they sort of use a combo of those things. Maybe there's, a lot of that going on. Maybe lots of variants, lots of different linguistic features. And then, maybe there's this person four coming into play. And this person four, when they're talking to persons one, two, and three, might say things like bag or baga or sorta. So like similar, but like we see some differences here in the linguistic features. And they also might have another word like sanji, which maybe some of you know and some of you don't, but it means bag. And then when that person talks to, somebody else, this person five, so now the things in pink, you'll see sort of are maybe less familiar for those of you who are don't know the language that I'm talking about, that I will reveal. But there's sort of other things maybe going on. So this is like sort of like etc. There might be other stuff that's happening, other types of linguistic features that are shared in those contexts, right? And so when I'm talking about how, we sort of think about language, we can put circles around all of these sort of instances and all of these sort of circles. We can sort of name, we can assign labels to those circles. And so maybe person three is speaking Minnesotan English, maybe person two is speaking Northeast English, maybe person one is bivarietal or bidialectal, and they're sort of speaking sort of both of these. Person four, if you didn't know, they're using features linguistic features that are associated with Malayalam or Malayali English. And then we can also sort of label that big circle on top, like a macro language, English. And that's sort of a label that we can give that. And then person 5 maybe is someone who's speaking Malayalam. And so, we go from these sort of like linguistic feature way of thinking about things, and then we have this sort of emergent clusters of consistencies of linguistic features across people and space and time, and we can sort of label those languages right? This is like maybe very Ling 101, and it is on purpose, and that's sort of the point. So, we recognize as linguists, these boundaries, these sort of circles are socially constructed, right? That's like really one of the first things I think that we tell students when we talk about what is language, and sort of get them to think about language in a linguistic way. And these labels are not just useful as shorthand, but they have social reality, right? So speakers themselves have an idea of what is English, what is Malayalam, what is Minnesotan English, whatever that is. So they're useful in that way, but they also have a social reality, which that means that makes them relevant objects of study, right? So this isn't just like, just because we're thinking about things in terms of like these labels doesn't mean that we're not doing something that's relevant. But, and this is what I want us to think about, sometimes our theoretical assumptions and our default practices can lead us to sort of starting with the circles and linguistic features, and then trying to figure out, okay, then we sort of maybe explain what's happening with people based on that. So we sort of start naturalizing these circles as being something that they're not, which is emergent and socially constructed. And then what happens is, so, you might get situations where the linguistic features appear might not, sort of happen in a way that you expect. See people using linguistic features in contexts where you wouldn't necessarily predict it. What do you call it? Sorry. You get situations where, you don't have, sort of one core thing that you can say like this, is indicative of this language or this variety, and to the exclusion of all else. And then people start asking questions like this, all right? So when we sort of take the people out of it, when we naturalize these socially constructed boundaries, when things maybe happen in ways that we would predict from an emergent perspective, but maybe not so predictive if we're naturalizing those boundaries, we end up getting sort of stuck asking certain types of questions. So we end up getting stuck asking questions like, what's pure Malayalam? Is this code switching or borrowing? Is this a loan word? Is this part of Malayalam? Is it not? Are those speakers exceptional? Like, what's going on with those speakers? Maybe there's something wrong with them. Maybe they don't know Malayalam anymore. Is Malayalam being lost, or is this language sort of, not existing anymore? And these are, sort of types of questions that we can get stuck in. And I want to first, sort of address these types of, I'm talking about Malayalam because it was a language that I grew up speaking, a language that I study. And I study language contact in Malayalam. So these are questions that have gotten asked to me in different ways and in different spaces. And so what I want to do is first go through these questions and tell you sort of an alternate way of reframing those questions. And then I'm going to step back and talk about where do these types of, like, what are the assumptions that lead us to ask this set of questions as opposed to another set. All right. So maybe we have a question like, what's pure Malayalam? But I would sort of posit that a more interesting question might be, what are speakers' notions of pure Malayalam or pureness, right? So this is bringing back that social construction or that sort of ideology into it. And maybe instead of asking, is this code switching or borrowing? Is linguistic material from heterogeneous sources being deployed differentially? How metapragmatically salient or socially relevant is source? Instead of maybe asking whether speakers are exceptional, we could instead ask things like, how widespread or consistent are these types of language practices? What types of language experience are they associated with? And maybe instead of asking a question like, is Malayalam being lost? We could ask a question like, what are speakers' observations or priorities when it comes to things like language shift or feeling as if a language is being lost or not? All right, and so, I hope you see that I hope it doesn't feel like those questions on the side are like straw manning. Those are, I think, really real questions that people ask. And sometimes we ask them in a way that is sort of a shorthand for maybe the more complex question. But I want us to really think about what happens when we ask questions in this sort of binary way versus in a different type of way. And so one thing to think about, and this is sort of something I've come to, when thinking about this problem of language contact, how do we capture variation? How do we characterize participants or speakers' language experience? What assumptions are underlying these questions, and where do these assumptions come from? And what I'll sort of argue or try to bring in is this idea of essentialism, or this essentialist ideas. And these ideas can be traced from the beginnings of linguistics really as a discipline. And so again, I'm sort of going to use a slide that I use in class to talk about this idea of essentialism. So here's like sort of the Ling 101 version of it. So essentialism, one version of that is we can think about it as the treatment of individuals as if they're the same as others in their race, sex, gender, religion, size, ethnicity, etc. So this is a very, some of you might have way more sort of complex or nuanced versions of this. Is a simple version. And the way we talk about this in class, we talk about how this is connected to misconceptions about things like biological, inherent, innate, or genetic sources of differences between groups and individuals. And so this really, if we were sort of in a class, then this would lead into discussions of things like, for example, Creole exceptionalism, or racial hierarchies built on linguistic hierarchy. So these really important topics that have to do with the history of our discipline. So here's another way of thinking about essentialism. So, another way of thinking about it is that it's an assumption that certain linguistic practices or types of linguistic knowledge or intuitions are immutable or material. And what happens often when we have essentialist assumptions about language experience or language use is that then when we see deviations from this, they're often framed as like a lack or a loss. So we see deficit perspectives being associated with that. And this also importantly presumes a really static notion of language experience as well. And I would argue it's still connected to misconceptions about these types of sort of innate or inherent sources of differences between groups or individuals. And so that's really high level. I want to get down to like a really sort of, maybe ostensibly harmless, but really ubiquitous example in linguistics and in something that happens in linguistics classrooms, but also just amongst linguists in general. So, and this also has to do with my own interest in judgments or syntactic judgments as a method. So this is a question that I've been asked a lot, and I've had discussions about, maybe some of you have done too, which is asking maybe something like, do you have judgments in Malayalam? Or do you have judgments in Malayalam? Or maybe people might say, my judgments are wrong in Malayalam or off in Malayalam because of this, or my judgments in English are off because I teach syntax or something, right? So we have this way of talking about judgments as if you have them or you don't. And what we know, and everyone who does this, again, right, a lot of us, we all know that, and especially from the literature and experimental syntax, where we really look at what judgments are and what goes into them, we know that there are a host of factors that could influence judgments or intuitions, even for, quote, monolinguals. And so what happens is in some cases, we get the sense of like, if I don't have judgments in something, or if you do, or if our judgments differ, then it becomes about that person and what their experience is, as opposed to sort of, maybe like, it becomes about that person. And if they have this sort of on and off switch of judgments, as opposed to, let's sort of think about like, how sort of on and off or objective, quote, this judgment might be. And in some contexts, we see this in linguistics context, leading to sort of arguments from authority. So like, well, I have this type of experience, so my judgment matters more than you. And one thing I want to sort of mention and bring in to this, connects it when I've talked about this issue, over the past couple of years in different venues, there's always somebody who talks about a time when someone told them, you can't have judgments in this language. And people talk about how that really makes them feel in classroom settings. I was told that, and that's why I ended up doing experimental work in syntax instead of other types of syntactic approaches, which ended up fine for me. But we can really think about how this way of sort of talking about intuition and linguistic intuition can be a source of gatekeeping and also exclusion in classroom settings. That's something that I, sort of want us to think about a little bit. And maybe also for those of you like me, if you've experienced that, I stand in solidarity with you. I know it's a really a common thing to experience. On the other hand, or this, another side of this, which has also come up, is that it can be really empowering, right? When students realize, oh, my intuition is a source of knowledge that really matters. And that's a really empowering and awesome thing about linguistics. And that can be really great in linguistic classrooms, for example. But I think we just really have to be careful and think about how we frame that, especially for people who are coming into our discipline, but in general, because it does still reinforce certain types of experiences as being the ones that count. And then that which reinforces certain types of people as being the ones who can contribute, right? And if we think about the social dynamics of who ends up speaking majoritized varieties of languages or languages that are, spoken by socially powerful people, that really becomes important. And we really see how different other types of sort of structures of oppression can then get recapitulated in classroom and other types of settings. So I'm going to focus on a related issue, which is related to this idea of like having judgments or not, because one way that we think of like who gets to have judgments or who gets to have intuitions and whose intuitions matter is thinking about this idea of nativeness and native speakers or native signers. And so we're going to focus on a particular case, and I want to really talk. This came from a seminar that I did. So we had a grad seminar in fall of 2020, which was, as we all remember, a wild time. But I feel so grateful to have worked with these amazing students, and we have these 2 projects that came from it. And all of us were sort of thinking together about this issue of nativeness in linguistics. And so one of the papers from that project is already out. And that's, that's the problematic concept native speaker in psycholinguistics. That's in Frontiers in Psycholinguistics. And so I'm here, the collaborators on that. And then we have another paper and also an LSA presentation. And so the link to that is at the OSF link there. But we have a manuscript that's going to be ready, hopefully, to be distributed soon. That's towards a more general audience, whereas the first paper is more about psycholinguistics. And so here are my amazing collaborators on that project. And so these are students that span all Michigan students, although one of them now has gone to grad school at Columbia. So we have a previous Michigan student that are in anthro and linguistics and psychology. So we have students from all over. All right, so let's think about nativeness, this idea of native speaker. So I'd like you to reflect, and I'm going to open my chat. I forgot to open it before. So please reflect, but also you can throw in the chat, or you can just reflect on your own. What is a native speaker or a native signer? What does that mean to you? What does it mean in your field that might be different than what it means to you? And what characteristics are entailed or maybe implied by this term? So I want us to sort of take a minute to think about that. And hopefully while I was vamping and repeating myself, you had time to think. And thank you. So Rachel brought up a really important point that's going to come up a little bit later. So Rachel brought up a point in the chat, which is that for her, native is really associated with indigenous. And so this is definitely something that has come up, especially when we're reading like Native First Nations authors about this topic, was that like, it's so weird that linguists use the word term native because it's about indigeneity. So why are you even using that? And so Ryan says a common use is first and most comfortable language. I think that's a great like sort of thing that I think a lot of people would agree with. Lena says this is really important. In sign language linguistics, a native signer often means a deaf signer who's raised by deaf signing parents. Some researchers prefer that parents are native signers too, because they argue that native and non-native signing parents provide different kinds of input to their deaf children. This is a really important place, and I'm going to be really drawing upon the theorizing in some cases of deaf scholars and deaf linguists who have, I would argue, spoken language linguists have these sort of toxic ideas of nativeness that have then been imported into sign language linguistics in a way that, maybe if we had sort of cleaned house a little bit in spoken language linguistics, that wouldn't be as much of an issue in sign language linguistics. I don't know, but I think that spoken language linguists, we have to really think about this and how different ideas of when languages are acquired and when that they need to be acquired in order for a language to be native, how that applies or doesn't across different contexts. Some researchers conflate monolingual and native, and that's like 100% like, a really common like sort of conflation, and it might be like implicit or explicit. Native speaker equals no accent. I think that's a really great comment too, because it's like, thinking about what sort of is an accent, what's perceived as an accent or not. And we know from work, for example, by Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores on white listening subject, that a lot of times accentedness is in the mind of the beholder, right? And so these are really important. And then I think a really important point that Molly brought up are implications of naturalized ownership of a language and related evaluations as to competence. So this is a really important point that often also, especially when we think about sort of power dynamics of, especially if you use or speak a minoritized language or variety, you can think about feeling authority or ownership over that language. And that can be sort of, framed in positive ways, but also kind of negative ways as well. All right, so thank you, everybody. And yeah, heritage language bilinguals, that's also something where they often get constructed as having no native language. This is something that I have felt imposed upon me as well. So in our paper, thank you so much, everybody, for thinking this through. And if you still have more stuff, you can throw it in the chat, but I'm going to move forward. So in our paper, we talk about these sort of three facets of nativeness. We talk about nativeness as history, like an individual's language history. And I have Loretta's face here because Loretta is the one that synthesized this point really beautifully in this slide that we make in a different way in the paper. So I want to make sure that she gets a credit for that. So nativeness as personal history, nativeness as current proficiency or usage. And we can also think of nativeness as identity. And I think nativeness as identity is one that is very related to sort of maybe a more non-technical, or like the way that people who maybe aren't linguists might think of it. But also sometimes that's relevant for linguists as well. All right, so we really, can think about there's these sort of different facets. And what's really important, I think, for us to think about is this idea, sort of like this intuition thing. Do you have intuitions in X? Are you a native speaker of X? Can often be a loaded question, just like Javier said. A lot of, especially for this, group of heritage language speakers, that can be a really sort of problematic and challenging question to answer, right? It's connected to identity, ability, and I'm putting that in quotes because who gets to decide what ability is, exposure, access, all these things which are often influenced by forces outside of an individual's control. And one thing that we talk about in this forthcoming work, and I really need to give so much credit to our linguistic anthropologist collaborators on this, which they really talked about how this has become iconicized. This idea of native speaker or nativeness has been iconicized and associated with these sort of as a stand-in for these different other things. So it's a proxy for things like, you think of people who are native speakers as being abled. So monolingual, neurotypical. Literate, it might be the language, you have to be maybe literate or schooled in that language and sometimes to count as native. It might be the language that's dominant for you, or the language that belongs to you culturally, the language that you use the most, the language that you use the earliest. And for almost every single person, I would say this is not covered by one language or variety. And for the people for whom this is covered by one language or variety, those people are probably very likely to come from socially powerful groups. All right, so that's really important to think about, right? Because all these things are based on things like factors outside of people's control, like, socioeconomic factors, language policy, history of colonialism, all of these different things, it directly does have to do with, as we know, our sort of social position. And so I want us to sort of think about, and this is some work that we do in this paper that really is drawing upon two really great books on this topic. So one is by Stephanie Hackert, and she talks about English native speaker, and she really carefully connects early uses of this native speaker, English native speaker. And she shows that they were consistently associated with myths of Anglo-Saxon racial and linguistic purity. And I put that in quotes because that is really this idea of Anglo-Saxon has been problematized a lot by medievalists. That's something that I encourage you to look at a lot more if you're interested in this idea. And she really connects this to colonialist and racial/linguistic hierarchies. And Vijay Ramjatan has talked about this idea of English native speaker being really meaning in lots of cases, especially in English language teaching, meaning white. And Bonfiglio also talks about this. And so in that work, it traces materialist and essentialist notions of native speaker. There's lots of different threads that we can see throughout European thought, but also in particular to Dante. So Dante discusses a pervasive ideology that one's primary language is transmitted through breast milk. And this breast milk language transmission thing comes up a lot. Like it comes up in the mid 1800s as well. I've been thinking about this a lot because I have a kid that I'm breastfeeding right now. So I've been like sort of weirded out by that. But anyway, we sort of talk about that and connect that with how people talk about our native language is the language that is learned by the mother's knee, which is how Bloomfield talks about it. And then what both of these works and other works as well really discuss is that, and this is something that might be familiar to a lot of you, we see this sort of like discrete mapping of language on the nation state in the 18th and 19th century, and the rise of nationalism in Europe accompanied the emergence of linguistics as its own discipline. So this idea of nativeness, of sort of language and identity as being materially connected with each other, essentially biologically connected with each other, these racial and linguistic hierarchies, all of these ideas, and linguistics as a discipline, all these things were emerging at the same time in the same intellectual ecology. And so a point that my collaborators, Annie and Justin, really clarified that connects these two things is we see this idea moving from this corporeal metaphor, so like this idea of language being transmitted like through milk or like through the body, to arboreal or like tree structure metaphors of how language works. And so we really see this direct connection between these two ideas. And you can really think about how we're thinking about language and identity as being really material and essential, how that can lead to all these sort of problems when we then start making hierarchies, right? Which is obviously what we have seen and what we've inherited a lot of these ideas to this day in our linguistic theories and approaches. So more sort of synchronically, right? Our sibling disciplines have really been theorizing this deeply. And this is something that, we talk about native speakers a lot in sort of linguistics and in unmarked linguistics. And I'm putting that in quotes because I'm going to problematize it later. But like, this has really been problematized a lot throughout. So, this has been associated with things like hegemonic monolingualism, whiteness, ideologies of languagelessness, authenticity, and linguistic purism. And there's a paper in the Journal of Pragmatics from 1997 that says nativeness is one of the founding myths of modern linguistics. So one of the things we say in our paper is that we could probably just write a whole paper about people complaining about nativeness, but what's going on? Why do we still have it? So let's keep thinking about that. And I encourage us to keep thinking about that as I keep going. And so one thing I want to, sort of bring in as well is this idea of like a deficit model. So we have deficit models of multilingualism where we have monolinguals and treated as the norm or unmarked or like neutral category. And this is something that's really implicit in lots of theoretical approaches. And like I've said, it's especially applicable to racialized individuals. So I want to think a little bit about this, sort of how we think about nativeness. And I think that a lot of times we think about idealized native speakers, we think about native speakers as an idealization. So this assumes that there's sort of a thing to be measured, that there's like a natural category, and there's some sort of like core ideal way of being a speaker. And what we encourage, and so this sort of, it's contrasted this other way of thinking about nativeness, which is what our other sort of sibling disciplines have been doing, is sort of saying, well, when we ask about nativeness, what we're really doing is we're asking about ideologies of nativeness. So it's again, bringing back this social construction, reminding us that this is a socially constructed idea. And this is researchers' ideologies, but also participants' ideologies, right? And so we can sort of think of this thing of like, if that little like floopy sort of shape is really represents the variation we see. Are we assuming that there is this sort of like core here of consistency that is this idealized native speaker? How are we conceptualizing that? And what we argue in our paper, in our Frontiers paper, is that native speaker and / signer is best thought of as an ideology as opposed to idealization. And then as I've been sort of talking, you might have noticed I've talked about a lot of different related ideas. In doing more work with our linguistic anthropologist colleagues, especially Addie Block and Annie Birkeland, what they've sort of said and brought this theorization forward, they've said that because this also evokes a set of related constructs, this idea of native speaker or signer maybe should be characterized as a language ideological assemblage, which means that it sort of evokes a bunch of different things. As opposed to an idealization, all right? So we really wanna get away from thinking of it as like, this is a thing that's out there in the world that's sort of naturalized, but no, we wanna sort of think of it as like, no, this is the category that we can point to, but it's a socially constructed and dynamic category. All right, so let's get a little more concrete. So a lot of us, I've done this, when does nativeness come into our world, right? Well, a lot of times when it comes to our world is when we're doing experiments and we're recruiting participants. So what we did was we did an experiment and then we asked the question of what would have happened if we recruited based on a question about nativeness. So we asked all participants at the very end of the whole experiment these two questions. So experiment on Hindi Urdu. We asked them, do you consider yourself a native speaker of Hindi Urdu or do you consider yourself a native speaker of English? 2 yes or no questions. And these are ways that we, those could have been recruitment questions for us. We were interested in syntax of Hindi Urdu, broadly speaking. And so this is follow work with Loretta, Matthew, and Ria, amazing collaborators here. And so Ria's, by the way, she's an undergrad at UT Austin. She's awesome. And Matthew and Loretta are amazing grad students at the University of Michigan. And so Ria is the one who did the recruiting, and the actual recruitment criteria was that participants need to be over the age of 18 and be able to understand Hindi Urdu. Speaking, reading, writing skills are not necessary. This is like taken from what she wrote. All right. So it was a very broad, they just had to hear sentences. So it was a very broad set of criteria. All right. So what we actually did was we asked a bunch of language background questions at the end of the experiment, which is what we do in our lab. We asked a lot of questions about exposure, comfort, and use, and we asked them using continuous measures. We also asked like about other types of experience, like where they lived and stuff like that. And then, like I said, we asked this question of, do you consider yourself a native speaker of Hindi, Urdu, or English? All right. So we had about, I think, 67 participants. So 31 of them said no to English, yes to Hindi Urdu, and 16 said yes to both. So, maybe if we're thinking about, all right, this nativeness sort of idea, maybe if we're a little bit broad and think, all right, you can sort of have multiple native languages. These are people that maybe we would have definitely recruited no matter what. So they would have been part of our sample. And maybe no one would sort of question if they get to count as a Hindi Urdu speaker. And then we also had 12 people who said yes to English and no to Hindi Urdu. But importantly, all these participants clustered with the others in terms of their responses on continuous measures of language use or experience. I'm going to show you that in a second. What's really important is that we had 8 people who said no to both. And this gets at the point that Javier brought up before about sort of feeling like you have no native language. Although people, this wasn't just people who grew up in the United States, people all over. And importantly, no other relevant language came up in this detailed questionnaire. All right, so this is really tapping into this sort of ideologies of languagelessness that folks have talked about, especially when it comes to people whose language practices are minoritized. So Loretta did this clustering analysis. And so what she did was she clustered participants based on their the gradient questions that we asked, so the sort of questions about language exposure and use and things like that, which are actually the measures that we care about. And then she also looked at how well that matched up to two different types of questions. One is where people grew up, and then the other is whether they self-identified as a native speaker or not. So she found these four emergent clusters. And then she did this, so she calculated this RAND index, which is a way of calculating how well sort of these categorical measures map onto emergent clusters. And so this RAND index, it spits out something from 1 to 0, and the closer it's to 0, the worse of a fit it is. They're both low, so they were both closer to 0 than 1, way closer to a 0. And for identifying as a native speaker, it was 0.197. So it's like very low, lower than other things that we looked at. So it didn't do a good job of mapping onto questions about language use, exposure, and experience. And, we have these sort of emergent profiles actually, which were really interesting. So, those profiles might be meaningful, and those were based on these different, gradient measures, but crucially, they didn't map onto this question about nativeness. So what we really cared about in this experiment was how language experience might influence behavior, right? And that's what I think a lot of us care about when we ask about language experience. We did not care about whether participants' ideologies about native status, about their native speaker status influence behavior. That might be relevant to some people or some research questions. It wasn't relevant to us, and I think it's not relevant to most contexts in linguistics or psycholinguistics. And what's really important is that there's an abundance of relevant theorizing about this. But in order for us to sort of think about this and talk this through, it really required us to adapt or import notions from fields that are constructed as being outside of linguistics, right? And so one thing that I want us to think about, I think, in big programmatic texts about what linguistics is about and what linguists are doing, people do say we're studying native speakers, but are we really? And I think that's something important for us to ask. Maybe we are sometimes, but when we're sort of thinking about this idea of nativeness and centering it, who are we systematically excluding is an important question to ask ourselves. What's the population we want to target, and who are we actually targeting? Are native and non-native speakers being characterized in comparable ways? So one really important thing, this comes from the bilingualism literature. Serene and Luck did a study where they looked at how monolinguals and bilinguals, the questions people asked to monolinguals and bilinguals, and people just assume that monolinguals are homogenous and bilinguals are heterogeneous, right? And we know that that's not the case. And we know that this idea of monolingualism is also very complicated and probably, definitely needs to be interrogated. And, ultimately, what type of language experience really matters for our studies? So I don't want to just leave us with let's problematize this and just think about it. We have some best practices. We have more in the paper for sure. But just to give you a takeaway here, what we sort of came up with as some best practices, we're asking targeted questions while recruiting, being explicit, consider using continuous measures. What really cool thing we found is that we could do this sort of emergent clustering and have interpretable results with 67 participants, which is not that many. And so we're trying right now to think about how we can scale it down and scale it up and see if it still can be meaningful. We should really consider how control groups are constructed in comparisons, and making sure that we don't reinforce deficit perspectives. And also construct more explicit theories. So we're hoping that having more specific notions of nativeness will encourage us to do this as well, about how language experience might mechanistically influence linguistic knowledge or behavior, which is definitely what I care about, when I'm thinking about language contact and psycholinguistic explanations for contact effects. But what we also know is that this requires not just individual changes, but structural changes, right? So I know some people, when we're talking about this issue, said, well, my reviewers made me sort of have a control group of native speakers, right? or my reviewers made me say native speaker as opposed to something else. So we know that there are these different barriers to sometimes making these changes, but we all have sort of different spheres of influence. And so I want us to sort of think about that as well. Like, how do we sort of make changes to conventions? And I'm going to zoom out now and really think about this idea of, you know, these different ways of looking at how to deal with variation, how to deal with categories. And one thing that I've been noticing over the past few years is that there's a lot of convergence across different disciplines and approaches in sort of alternate framings of questions, from more essentialist ways of looking at language and experience to these really centering social construction. So Cherise King's work is a great example, but also we can sort of bring in also a lot of third wave sociolinguistics in general. Cherise King's work denaturalizes whiteness as a proxy for place. And she looks at personae, and personae are these emergent profiles. And so what she's asking is not a question like, do Black people participate in local sound changes, or do people, who are racialized as not white participate in local sound changes, which is something that, sort of has been a hegemonic way of constructing that question in different sociolinguistic approaches. But she asks, how are place and race constructed in language or done in language, right? So we can sort of, we could do the same study in many ways, but we're asking fundamentally different questions, and that really matters. This also relates to different types of usage-based approaches. So not all language users, Eva Dabrowska's work assumes that not only language users are expected to show things like island violations. And so under this approach, individual differences shape emergent patterns. So, this is shifting from not asking, are people who don't show superadditivity missing a linguistic constraint, but rather what aspects of particular constructions will modulate the degrees of variation in superadditivity, which is a way of measuring an island violation, right? So this also, a lot of you might have been thinking about translanguaging approaches, right? So these approaches don't presume that language boundaries are natural. So instead of asking questions like, is it code switching or borrowing, you can ask, how are semiotic resources being employed? Lepik and Aquino talk about this same type of idea in another way as well. So arguing against not just sort of naturalized boundaries between languages, but between what is language and what is not. And so there's like these sort of debates about, is this language or is this gesture? And what Lepik and Aquino argue is that instead of asking, is it language or is it gesture, we should ask questions about like, how conventionalized are particular forms, or, sort of asking more about how those forms or constructions are used differentially, as opposed to putting them in one bin versus another. And we can see way more than this. So like things like individual difference approaches that assume true variation, approaches that assume gradients in grammar, assuming that emergent categories are emergent. This also relates to exemplar theoretic approaches. It relates to approaches that really think about semiotic resources, approaches that urge us to expand notions of what language practices are relevant for deaf language users. So beyond just sort of like manual signing, thinking about a more expansive set of semiotic resources that are available in communication. And also this idea of cryptlinguistics that Henner and Robinson have talked about. So decentering abled or spoken language practices as being the core of what we're asking about as linguists.
Recording in progress.
Oh,
so this data is.
Sorry. Okay, I think we're good. Yeah. All right. So, like I said, we do see these convergence fields and approaches. So I don't want to seem like, oh, sort of, I'm coming up with this. I think that it's been especially important, like I said earlier in the talk, to really learn from our colleagues who are working in disciplines or from spaces where they themselves are minoritized in terms of their language practices, and thinking about what the theorizing from those spaces can tell folks who are not working in that space, or whose own language practices or the language practices of the people that they're studying are not marginalized in that way. And so these general ideas that we see across these approaches are decentering the types of language experience and practices which have traditionally been constructed as core, the central questions in linguistics, emphasizing the social construction of categories, moving from categorical to gradient views, and presuming variation. All right, so going back to this way of sort of thinking about variation, right? So if we're probing a linguistic pattern or constraint, we can think about this is the sort of linguistic pattern or constraint. And then maybe what we measure or what we see is sort of this mess, but like there is a core there, right? That's one way of looking at it. And that might be what's going on, but it also might be that we have this other type of underlying structure there. And if we don't ask the question in that way, we're never going to allow ourselves to see that type of structure. And even if there isn't that structure there, right? Even if we do have sort of like, even if something is categorical, how do we think about or theorize the sort of quote mess in between? Is that seen as something that we need to get rid of or explain away? Or is that seen as also part of what we're trying to explain? We're trying to explain language use. So one thing that I think is important is when we're thinking about resisting boundedness or questioning categories or rigidness, that doesn't just mean that everything goes and everything's crazy and weird. I think it's exciting because it's an opportunity for us to ask more specific and fine-grained questions. And what we do know is that socially constructed boundaries are social facts. So that is important. And so what guides and shapes those boundaries can be the object of study. And this is what's happened in a lot of sort of linguistic anthropology, has really gone in that direction. But as linguists, we also need to resist naturalizing those boundaries. And so I think that, for example, the work of Stefan Höder is really exciting because he brings in this idea of subjectivity and linguistic and social categorization into linguistic representation itself as a part of like, this is what we're analyzing when we're analyzing a loan word or when we're analyzing a syntactic structure. And like I've sort of said, and I'm going to wrap up because I think I'm out of time soon. So I'm almost done. But not only does this matter for how language works, right? So how we think about how we sort of assume what variation is there, it really matters for our theories of how language works. That's important. But it also has consequences for whose language practices and experiences are treated as worthy of study, whose language practices and experiences are pathologized or treated as deficient, who is seen as having a language or a native language, how we deal with variation in practical ways as well as conceptual ways, and also what research is seen as linguistic or theoretical or empirical. And what I want us to think of when we think about this idea of linking this with social justice is, I think a lot of times we think about, well, if we include more languages or varieties, or maybe languages that are spoken by minoritized people, that's what we're doing when we're doing social justice and linguistics. And I want us to really encourage ourselves to go further than that. And so one thing that I've been working on with some colleagues is this idea of moving beyond inclusion and towards transformation. This idea of transformation comes from decolonial thought or transformational thought in South Africa. And so they like to think of it as transformation instead of decoloniality to really emphasize what needs to be done. So rather than simply including more languages or varieties, what I think we need to do is really interrogate how our practices and these practices that come from these white supremacist colonialist histories imbue our theoretical and methodological approaches, no matter who we are and what language we're studying. It's relevant for all of us. And so I really want us to think about what more we can all do as linguists. So when we center native speakers and so I want to think about this idea of disciplinary boundaries, because I brought that up before. So it's really not an accident that much of the theorizing on this topic is in fields that are constructed outside of core linguistic fields. So the rejections of the centering of nativeness has contributed to disciplinary differentiation. So this sort of goes back. People have been complaining about this for a really long time, and those folks have sort of left, they've sort of been like, well, I'm going to do linguistic anthropology now, or something like that. So it's really something that's part of our history as a discipline. And so what are these core questions? And I've already sort of said this before, but I want to connect this to some work that I've done, and my collaborator, Lena, is here. And so this is from our LSA talk, from our survey on harassment and bias in linguistics. And we asked the question, have you ever been told that you're not a linguist or the work you do isn't linguistic? And 42% of participants said yes. And this really matters for what experiences people are bringing in. This matters for the future of our disciplines, matters for how we're defining our sort of object of study or our field in general. So I really encourage us to think about how this also causes harm as well. And so really, what is lost when we draw these lines, right? What empirical domains are we losing? What contributions are we losing? And what students or researchers are being excluded from participating, but not just participating, thriving, because that should be the goal in our academic spaces. So some ways forward. I've really benefited and been grateful from learning from theorizing in sibling disciplines. Destabilizing deficit perspectives is something that we really need to think about. For me, it's been really helpful to embrace emergentist or individual differences approaches, because as I've been thinking about it, if we ask a gradient question, it allows us to get a gradient or a categorical answer. But if we ask a categorical question, we don't have any hope of learning about any sort of other interesting structure in the questions that we're asking. In order to do this, we need to shift norms in reviewing, hiring, promotion, and teaching, and really resisting the boundedness, both disciplinarily and in how we characterize languages and their users. So I want to thank all of you again for your attention. And I hope that these ideas, I've been thinking about them in different spaces, so I hope it made sense the way they went together. But I'm here for answering any questions. And I mostly want to thank my amazing collaborators. And I've been so grateful and lucky to work with these brilliant people. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Savvy. Yeah, so people are free to put questions in the chat, but of course you can use the raise hand function as well. Savvy, if you want to call in your own questions, go for it, but I'll like hang around and make sure we don't miss any in the chat, I guess.
Thanks, Carly. Yeah, I can do it. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got about a half hour for questions, so we have plenty of time.
Yeah, Rachel.
Thanks for this. I loved hearing it in this way. So, our group at the University of Oregon in the Speech Reception Production Lab with Melissa Baisberg are talking about this, and I don't want to call it from the other side, but we're thinking about non-native and conceptions of non-native, and how we're sort of at this impasse in us discussing it, because we're talking about terminology and like, what does it mean to change terminology? That's a symptom of the problem, not necessarily going to be a solution. And so describing the ways that we can look at this in the experimental frame. And so one of the big points that Melissa has us thinking about is, if we, for every question that we ask about non-native speaker, we need to be asking it that same question, or a question to the perceived like native normative. And I was just wondering if you had any other thoughts about what it means to come at this thinking about the native side versus the non-native side. I know you think about both, but I hope that umbrella can maybe give you some things to tell me about.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's such a great question and such an important point. And this, in particular, the point that you brought up of changing terminology is not enough so we also make that point in our paper, and we've been really thinking about this, because one easy thing that can be done is we just don't use the term native and then use something else, right? But really, that's why it's been helpful for me to think about this idea of language ideological assemblage, even though I love linguistic anthropologists. It helps me, but I'm like, oh man, it's dense sometimes. I know that I feel like such an outsider. So anyway, but that part has been really helpful, because it has encouraged me to think about, no, it's not about the terminology, it's about the construct itself. So I think the exact thing that you're talking about, if we're asking a question from one group, we want to ask an analogous question of the other group. is extremely important, because one thing, and this is another thing that Loretta and Matthew and I are working on next, is thinking about, sort of deconstructing this idea of a homogenous monolingual and or a homogenous native speaker versus, because we really think about like, where is it complicated? It seems like there's for some reason we think of non-native speakers or like these speakers who are maybe language learners or outsiders in some way, however other ways that that's constructed, we think of that as being where the like issue or the problem is. And that is reflected both in the questions that we ask, but also how we sort of worry about it, or how we, how we theorize what's happening there. And so I think if we really start, so maybe this is the opposite of what you asked, because you were like, what about the non-native thing? And I'm saying we need to sort of weird the native people and the speakers, or whatever, the speakers that are centered in order to deconstruct this. And maybe that's one way of doing it, but I don't know if I have, I'm excited to keep thinking about this with a lot of people who are trying to, who are moving this direction. I know that Melissa Baysberg Lab and you are also part of that movement. So, yeah. There's a question in the chat. So it says, Savi, I know from your research that you employ a variety of methods. I wonder if you have any anecdotes from those different methods that could be illustrated for your inclusion versus transformation point that you made, only if there's something that comes to mind. Okay. Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm like someone who really loves thinking about methods. The way that I've been thinking about inclusion versus transformation has been more right now at the conceptual level of really thinking about how, just like asking different questions. And I think that is sort of step one. But then once we ask different questions, then we also need methods that align with that too, in different ways. And so I know something, for example, that Rachel has done and that she's encountered is, doing EEG. And when you have a lot of Black participants, there's some issues that come up, and Rachel can talk about that much more, like better than I can, but she's had to come up with a whole protocol to deal with that, right? For example. And one thing that I've been looking at is pupillometry before the pandemic. And I found that a lot of the commercial eye trackers wouldn't be good at measuring pupil size in people with dark eyes. And so it's like when we start asking different questions, and the participants that we look at become a different set of participants, and then we end up having to sort of make changes or figure things out. And so that has been one aspect of that journey. Thinking about methods in another way, statistical methods has been really, rethinking that has also been helpful. So using things like these clustering methods or other sort of inferential bottom-up methods have been really helpful for enacting, in our statistical analysis, the research questions that we're asking. So doing exploratory analyses and like, oh my God, I can't think of the word now. I want to say like multiple worlds analyses. It's not what it is. It's when you have different ways of analyzing something and then you compare them. I can't think of it right now. I'm so sorry. I have mom brain. But yes, so there's different statistical methods that we need to use as well that sort of map on to that. So that means also like not sort of just doing between groups ANOVA, for example. Okay, Juan asks, thank you. It sounds like the term monolingual means critical theorizing, maybe urgently, yes. Can you share about any ideas you have in this direction or work that you're familiar with, including work that discusses the origins and uses of this term? Yeah, so I know there's Elizabeth Ellis is somebody who has done a lot of work on this idea of monolinguals, like what are they? And she's really like problematized that category. I think that's really helpful. The other area where I've seen people do really careful work in this, and this is just coming from my own discipline, so there's probably a lot more that I don't know about, but are folks doing individual differences approaches. So there's a paper I cited earlier, first author is Evan Kidd, Morton Christensen, and then someone else is on it. But they talk about individual differences approaches in language processing and language acquisition. And that's another place where, people are really assuming sort of true variation between people who might be otherwise homogenized as being like a group. And so those are some places to sort of broadly look. And we're hopefully going to be doing some of that ourselves in our lab as well. So also watch out for that. But I know that there is work on this from different angles, and I think we just need to keep doing it as well. Yeah, Shrikar, your hand is up.
Hi, Savithry. Thanks for the talk.
Hi.
So towards the end, there was a slide on, say, people moving away from doing quote unquote theoretical linguistics based on their criticisms that linguists don't define what they mean by native. Now, obviously, some of the criticism at least is valid, I think, but like, I wonder to what extent it's because of either us not explaining our assumptions more clearly or just unclarity on each other's parts. Because at least for generative linguists, the notion of a native speaker is kind of trivial, right? Because at the end of the day, we're studying I languages. So like, it's my language and I'm the only native speaker of that. So yeah. So to what extent is this just unclarity as opposed to like a serious problem?
Yeah, so this is such an important point, and we talk about this. So my collaborators on this forthcoming paper, Justin and Jordanis, especially Justin Kraft and Jordanis Sideros, they both have done a lot of work in this area because they both really are coming from a generative perspective. And so they talk about this very thing that you said, Shrikar, which is, why are we centering this topic in generative syntax or phonology anyway? That's like not what we're doing anymore. We're talking about I languages. Like, so that approach actually like sort of aligns a lot more with these other usage-based approaches in terms of how we characterize individuals' language use. So that is like, I think that's a really good point. I think that is part of it. But I also do know, and it's the case, that some of it might be, this idea of sort of taking it for granted and treating it as trivial might be then maybe making it easier to then sort of be less careful about it and how it's used in classrooms and also in our research. And so maybe that is sort of part of it, maybe what really needs to be done. I would really be excited. Our folks were really deeply in that area to theorize it. And I think what ends up happening, which is what Justin and Jordanis came to, is like, this actually isn't helpful for us either. So we really should be thinking carefully about that, not just the term, but also the other things that come with that. And so, and sort of go back to the initial part of your question, which is like people moving away from like theoretical or formal approaches. I don't like the idea of theoretical linguistics. All linguistics theoretical. That's like ridiculous. But that's why I put it in quotes. Or if I did on the slide, it definitely was like that. It is something that has been reported, like it came up in our survey on harassment and bias in linguistics. It's come up when I've given talks. It happened to me myself. So it is something that is out there and something to think about. And I think it just means that we just need to, I think you're right. It might just be about just being a little bit careful about it, or just being aware that this is something to know, that this is a spot that's perceived accurately or not a place of sort of boundary making. Yeah, but that's such a good point. It's like, yeah, we're sort of beyond that. So why are we thinking about it? Thank you.
We had a question from Cynthia saying, Savi, did you receive sometime deaf people in your class? If yes, what method did you apply with them? I see that Ryan also gave a really helpful response to Cynthia, but if you have your own thoughts. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. Ryan is an expert on this because he teaches at Gallaudet. And so he is someone who has thought about this. I've only had hard of hearing students in my class. I've not had, or students who identify as hard of hearing, not students who identify as deaf. And I've had students who are asking for things like captions, but not interpretation, for example. So yeah, that's sort of the limit of my experience in that area. But thank you for that question.
And earlier during your talk, someone asked a question, how about the term near native speaker? How is this term complicating the concept of native speaker?
Yeah. And so this kind of goes back to also what Rachel was talking about, which is like this idea of non-native. And some, there's all these papers that are sort of railing against native speaker that you can find. They just happen to a lot of times be in journals that I'm not starting out reading, right? So that's like something that's my own like sort of training and like, sort of how fields are constructed. That was how my experience was. So like in these spaces where this idea is being problematized, people are like, it's so strange, right? You don't say people are either left-handed or non-left-handed. So why are you saying they're native or non-native? Like, this is really weird. And this idea of near native, so I know there's a paper that we cite in our Frontiers in Psycholinguistics paper that really goes into this. And so what they do is they sort of like really like divide up, right, people. And what they find is like, oh, there's this group of, so this study that I'm thinking of looks at near nativeness in like, I think it's Swedish. And so they find this group of people where they behave just like the other people that might be considered native speakers in this more like really, more conservative or traditional or whatever core sense, but in almost every way, and they're perceived as being native, but then there's these other slight differences that we see, right? So some slight differences. So then they get categorized as near native. But when you look at their graph, what they do is actually what we recommend, which is they plot the actual factor that they're interested in, which is age of acquisition. So what I would argue is, let's just talk about age of acquisition then, instead of talking about like near and sort of like dividing up these pieces. Like what is that gaining us? I think is such an important question. And one thing that I've been really thinking about is like, who wants to hold on to nativeness and why? Like, and not just in like who would want to do that? Like, I'm really curious, what are the advantage, like what are we gaining from centering this term? How is it helping us? And I feel like I haven't been able to find a way really that it has. So I hope that relates to that. So this idea of like, it's like, oh yeah, there's this interesting differences maybe in processing, which I care about. So it's like something that I thought was really interesting based on different types of language experience. Okay, that's fine. But why are we sort of categorizing people as not good enough or not native enough or something, that's where it loses me, I guess, personally.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And another thing I've thought about in my research working with heritage speakers is when we talk about being near native, for example, with one of my other languages, Albanian, I think I would be classified as near native because of my objective linguistic skills, but I learned it in my 20s. Whereas heritage speakers would have all sorts of intuitions and perhaps pronunciation that I don't have, but they might be very hesitant to call themselves native or even near native. They would say, oh no, I don't speak it very well. English is my big language. And so there seems like there are also two different types of near native speakers, or, these not quite comfortable calling themselves native speakers groups, and they might get conflated in very interesting ways or privileged in different ways.
Oh my gosh. Yes, that's such a good point, right? Because it also connects to, so there's like, I'm seeing like different things from what you're saying. So one is like these different facets of this thing that we call like nativeness, but like how that gets operationalized, right? We really actually care about the operationalizations. We care about that part. We don't, like a lot of times, right? And so we have this thing like history, identity, sort of like belonging, all of those things, which don't always map onto other aspects. That's like one aspect that's really important. And then the other thing is like, yeah, then when we then sort of say like, all right, I've recruited native speakers, or this person's a native speaker, like how informative is that really? And we did a sort of mini structured lit review that we didn't get to fully include in this Frontiers paper. And we really found just like very differing ways of, we have like a part of it is in there. So you can take a look. I think it's like the table 1 or something. And it has like all these different ways that native is operationalized, and they're very different from each other. Right. And so that also, has to do with like, yeah, what are we measuring? Like, are these comparable? Like, is this helping us? Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's, I think it really highlights how complicated it is, and just maybe not what we want to actually look at. Yeah. Or it might not be useful. I guess that's the other thing. It's even if you don't care about the other part, it's like, Might not be useful. That's fine.
Well, we definitely have time for more questions if anybody would like to. Oh, here we go.
Yes, yes. Javier, this is like, yeah, so Javier said, this is making me think of the deficit views of racialized bilinguals and academic incomplete acquisition and layperson, no sabo kids space. Yes. And I know for me personally, that's like where I came to some of these like questions. And then I also encountered them in my research. And then I was like, oh, this is, I see, so I totally agree. And there has been some, great work done on this topic of deficit models in general, of deficit models of racialized language users. And I think on that side where I talked about deficit models of multilingualism, a lot of that work has been done by, for example, like deaf scholars, as well as Black scholars and educational linguists as well. So that theorizing has been super helpful for me in thinking about what I want to change about my practice as a linguist, or my approach as a linguist, like doing like just what's going on with word order or something. And yeah, I think this idea or this point about racialized bilinguals in particular is also really crucial here. Thank you. The other aspect that made me think of, Javier, is like, and I had like some slides about it, but whatever, I had so many slides. So when I did my thesis work, I interviewed people in Kerala, which is a state in India where Malayalam is spoken, about, I did like sociolinguistic interviews and experiments. And so when I was talking to people, I asked them, sort of what do they think about the future of Malayalam, or what do they think about Malayalam in general? A lot of people brought up sort of stress around English, which I didn't ever bring up, but then that sort of came up. Malayalam is a high contact language. But also there were a lot of people who grew up in a place, so Malayalam is spoken by 35 million people. It's a big language. It's one of the national languages. It's one of the official languages of the state in which it's spoken. It's people who grew up in a place, they a lot of times might have been schooled in that language, and they said, I don't speak Malayalam. And I was like, what are we talking in right now? And so a lot of times we can see how these sort of essentialist ideas about language and identity, they come also from us. Like, I think we can also hold them. And they can also be sometimes part of the communities that we work in. And I think what's important, or what I try to think about as a linguist, is how to affirm the language practices of everybody that I'm working with or that I'm interacting with, and being like, your Malayalam is not broken. It's great. Not that I can say much about that as, an outsider in many ways, but at least from a linguistic perspective, I can say that, right? And that's, I think, something also that is important to think about. How are our sort of research questions and ways of asking questions reinforcing or pushing against these ideologies that can be really harmful? It's complicated. Oh yeah, Wafa asks, which one of the following labels reflect more nativeness for language, native language, or mother tongue? Good question. So we talked a lot, or we've thought a lot about this idea of there's different words, like first of all, this idea of native speaker. And so, yeah, one of my PhD advisor was saying, yeah, that there's no sort of analogous word in lots of languages for native speaker. Lots of people use things like mother tongue, and mother tongue is the locally relevant word in Malayalam as well. And mother tongue can mean really different things too. So I think this idea of, that's why I think thinking of nativeness as an ideology is so helpful, because then we can sort of ask, how is it used? Like, what people think what about it in what context, right? And so we can ask that question about nativeness, native speaker. We can also ask it about mother tongue as well. And so we find that mother tongue is constructed similarly really differently depending on where you are and who you are. And some people don't need to, some people don't actually use the language, and they consider themselves a native speaker or a mother tongue speaker of that language. which is fine, right? That's part of their allegiance or identity with that language. And so that's also something that's really interesting. That's a sort of its own area of research, which I haven't gotten into, and there's a lot of work. Actually, I have a book right here by Ray Chow called Not Like a Native Speaker. And that book also gets into this as well. Yeah, and he's coming from like world Englishes. Actually, I'm sorry, I don't know if I misgendered them. But coming from world Englishes, as well as sort of like post-colonial or decolonial context. That's like where you do see a lot of theorizing about this. There's so much out there, but I just don't see it in the spaces that I'm in. Thank you so much for that question. It's like a really good question. Yeah. And I guess the other thing I should say is it's not bad to feel like you have a native language, or to sort of, you know, like the idea of being a native speaker of a language or something. I think that that's not bad at all. I think it's more about thinking about when we use that as a analytic object. Is it helpful as an analytic object as a linguist, versus, you know, is it something that is a persistent ideology? And that's different, and that's fine. Or that's separate, I guess. I don't have any sort of, what do you call it? I don't have any opinion about the goodness of it. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask a question. I don't think I saw this in your slides, so I'm sorry if you did say it, but I don't think you've talked about the term L1, L2, et cetera. Do you find that helpful or just more confusing? Because again, what does the one mean?
Yeah, so that's like also this is something that we talk about, we've thought about a lot, of like this idea of like, do we want to we want to make sure that we're not replacing it with like another sort of term that has the same types of problems. If what we're really studying is L1, then that's fine to use like first language if that's what seems to be important. I think a lot of times that doesn't matter as much. So my L1 is not English, but I mean, I don't know. It's complicated, right? You know, and Claudia says heritage language is a problematic term as well. I agree. I don't use that term actually in my research. So because for these sort of similar issues of, you know, we want to get more specific than that. Okay, so maybe not using me as an example, but like, you know, what are we, why is this description of this person's language experience important? If what we're really asking is like, okay, we sort of ask people who use this language regularly, you know, or this person considers that language that they're most comfortable in, does it matter if they learned it first or not? And if they did, that's fine. That can be part of the research question, but sometimes we don't care about that and we still construct that in a way where we give that primacy, right? And that's one aspect. And then the other aspect that you brought up, Carly, is like, yeah, I mean, you might have multiple of them, or how would you know? Or people, you know, so this really gets at like, which aspect of that really, really matters. And I think the more specific we can get about that, the better it is. And this also gets to like, you know, sort of how people have been thinking about things like critical period. And you see like the, you know, the cutoff for critical period is this, and then it gets pushed to now 18, now it's 3, now it's 5, like so you see all these cutoffs. And of course we know that it's much more complicated than that. And so I think that these issues are very related in terms of, yeah, how using one term to mean a whole host of different factors can then be problematic or obfuscate the points that we're trying to make, or the questions we're trying to ask. Yeah. Yeah, so Javier's also talking about, so Claudia said heritage language problematic, English language learner. Yeah, so I know it's really great. I see in ELT spaces and SLA spaces so much theorizing and thought about these different terminologies, and like especially how they might construct students and teachers and their relationships to each other. And that's been really helpful for me to sort of read as an outsider, to think about, you know, sort of what constructs are here that are sort of related to or coming from things that we take for granted in other areas of linguistics. And so I really appreciate that type of theorizing being there.